I chatted to Dahlia yesterday and we agreed that I would talk about how to try and make sure that your research has impact on policymakers. And that'll be the focus for this talk. I have the inevitable PowerPoint, so I'll just share screen now, if that's okay. And don't worry, I'll send the slides to Dahlia and Mahmoud so that you don't need to write all this down. You'll get it later. Okay, so let's just go like that. Okay, is that visible? Great. Okay, so what do you have in mind when you think about getting impact on the real world with research? Is it this? So this is a placard from the March for Science in Washington in 2015. And I love it because it sums up a particular view, which is good research should speak for itself. It's got this whole system of peer review and is carried out by people who look like this, fairly nerdy, fairly sort of, introverted perhaps. I think it's just not true. So what I want to set out now are some ideas which I think are probably more productive in terms of when you do research, knowledge generation, how do you have impact on policy? And I wanted to talk about 4 pillars of doing this. So how do you understand the system? And that's including the system which is going to make the decisions you're trying to influence. Think about framing and timing of your research. Thinking about voice, who is actually presenting the research, and then the importance of relationships. And I'll come back to relationships over and over again. It's not normally something that you learn at grad school when you're studying research, and it's just about the most important thing. So researching the problem, obviously, that's what research does. We have a problem with climate change, we have a problem with tax evasion, we have a problem with adaptation, we're going to research it. But you also need to research the system into which your proposed solutions are going to drop. So you identify problems, causes, and possible solutions, but you also look at how decisions are made and who influences those decisions. And you use something we call power analysis, I'll explain this in a minute, to identify who has the power and capabilities to achieve the changes you're seeking. And who do they listen to? What influences them? Who influences them? And then the wider system is sometimes resistant to change and sometimes very open to change. So you need to understand the kind of tides in the wider system to know when your research is most likely to have impact. So think about the problem. This is a great quote from Einstein. If he had an hour to save the planet, he would spend 59 minutes thinking about the problem. And normally, at least in the CSOs, as Dahlia said, I work at Oxfam, we tend to think we know what the problem is, and we just want to shout at the policymakers and give them our preferred solutions. I think we should listen a bit more to Einstein and think, have we really dug down into the problem? Is it a problem of process? So this is you don't need to look at the detail, but this is a mapping that Oxfam did, I think in West Africa, about how do licenses get given out for small-scale miners, because we were worried that small-scale miners weren't getting a decent deal in that particular context. And what you realize is there are loads of stages in this process, many of which are difficult for small-scale miners. And by mapping out the process, you can start to see, okay, where could we, in this case Oxfam or your own organizations, where are we most likely to be able to have an influence? Where is there something we could grab hold of and work with? So understanding the process is definitely very useful. I think also going back to the Einstein quote, digging down into the problem. So you may say, the problem is governments aren't spending enough on adaptation. Why is that? Well, the problem is they're spending money on other things like debt servicing. Why is that? Because the donors and the aid agencies are demanding that they give priority to debt servicing. Why is that? Because there's no political push for them to do otherwise. You start to get to a place where you can, by digging down with what they call the 5 whys approach, you can start to dig down and find things you can work with. One final comment on this. If you ever get to the problem is lack of political will, shoot yourself, okay? Because saying that there is a lack of political will is basically saying politics can't do this, and I don't understand why. Okay, you have to get behind that statement about lack of political will to say, okay, well, what are the incentives? What's going on here? You never should be satisfied with lack of political will. It's shorthand and it's lazy. Once you get to the problem, you map the stakeholders. Who has influence? Who cares about this issue? In this case, say, climate change adaptation or local adaptation. And you can map them. And I think this is a very useful map for this kind of issue. On the x-axis is how powerful are these stakeholders. And on the y-axis is how supportive. Do they actually support? In this case, this is an internal stakeholder mapping from the Climate Action Network from 2015 in the run-up to the Paris Climate Summit. And the Climate Action Network would every 3 months come back and have another refresh this, because what it enabled them to do was to identify where people are on this spectrum of powerful and supportive. And from that, they could start to identify their allies, people they wanted to get into positions of more power, help them increase their influence, people they wanted to weaken. And it's a very useful schematic way to make sure you're thinking of everyone rather than just saying, well, we always work with civil society organizations, we'll just do that, right? When actually faith leaders or media or traditional chiefs or whoever might actually be really important allies in this as well. And once you do one of these stakeholder mappings, you can then start looking at clusters. And the nature of your research is determined by where these clusters are, right? So I've just highlighted 4 potential clusters. So cluster A is they agree with you and they're powerful, okay? So these are your natural allies. And what you do there, you don't need to convince them. They agree with you, right? So 2 things that may be worth doing. One is giving them more help with their campaign, with their influencing. They may want ammunition, killer facts, which I'll talk about in a bit. This is where research is really helpful. They may also not know each other. They may be in this cluster, but not be aware of each other, in which case you as a research organization or as a CSO can actually bring them together to do a piece of work and get them building relationships with each other so they start to just go off and start working together without you, which is perfect. Cluster B is where people are supportive. Farming communities know that climate change is a terrible thing and is really affecting them, but they have a low level of influence. So what's the role for a CSO or researcher in that situation? How do you build confidence, create better organized levels of organization and coordination between farmers' organizations? How do you use research to get them talking to the people who do have influence? Can you have seminars, papers which bring together farmers' organizations with academics, ministers, people who have power? Group C is people who are very influential but don't really care, don't think climate change is a big issue. There are many other priorities out there. What are you going to do with them? And there, I'm afraid, often it's not the quality of the research that matters, but who is presenting it. It's the messenger, not the message. So who will they fear or respect? I met a CSO in the Philippines, which deliberately employed the professors who had been the professors of people who are now ministers in the Philippines, because even though they are now big, important men, they're still terrified of their professors. And when the professor comes in the room, they suddenly shrink and go, what can I do to help, professor? So they deliberately use that power of the messenger to have influence. So think about who you get to present your research. It's often not the researcher who will say lots of terrible things like, it's all very complex, it's context specific, it depends. All of those are toxic to influencing. They just make you look as though you're more interested in your own academic credentials than actually changing things. So think about the messenger. And then the final group is people who are influential and opposed, probably not worth bothering with. You're not going to convince climate change deniers to change their minds, but you might want to weaken them, divide them, peel off some of their allies, make them look ridiculous, possibly, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily a top priority. POVA. So this is I don't know if you know this acronym, but it's the point of view of the other. in order to be a good researcher, you have to be able to think like a not researcher. You have to be able to think about what does the target need or want from this piece of work. And then match your evidence or the presentation of the evidence to match the target. Policymakers, ministers, they don't want to see regressions. They don't know what a regression is. They want to see big ideas, compelling stories, and they want positive. They don't want to hear that everything's terrible, that we're all going to die. They want to hear positive stories if you've got them, right? Civil servants can often be a bit more rigorous and a bit more objective and a bit more interested in things like the methodology, but not very. So we had somebody come to lecture at the LSE about how to influence the British Foreign Ministry. He's the head of research at the Foreign Ministry, and he says, I have 30 seconds to convince a senior civil servant that this piece of research is important. So you don't have much time. You can't give yourself the luxuries. You have to have a clear message, an elevator pitch, but you can at least show you're working. If you're trying to influence companies, they want to know, what does my company need to do? They want to know what other companies need to are doing. They want to know, and they want to hear it from other companies, that it's much better to send in another executive, corporate executive, than to send in a researcher or a CSO person. Communities want to know, how is this generated? Have we been involved with this? Nothing without us, nothing about us without us. And does it tell us as communities something useful? Activists and public in general want a human face. Much better to tell a story through a human example than lots of numbers, all right? Things that are easy to remember, and I'll come to those in a minute. And the media, if you go to the media and say, we've done this fantastic piece of research, it shows that what we thought was true is true, you won't get any coverage at all. You've got to have something controversial or new to say. Even if it's not that new, make it look new. And again, human face and killer facts. Timing really matters. So this is a thing called a policy funnel, which, like most good ideas, I stole from an environmentalist called Michael Jacobs. But it sets out, like, how does the debate around an issue we care about change over time? Over here on the left-hand side is when something is quite new and you're trying to get it into the public arena. You know, so 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Oxfam was trying to get people to realize that climate change was not just about polar bears. It was about people. And there, you're talking about big ideas. You're not talking about detailed policy initiatives. You're just trying to say, here's, you know, a big picture. And a colleague of mine, Kate Rayworth, who since has gone on to do some really good work on donut economics, just did the back of an envelope calculation about how much adaptation would cost globally. And she came up with, I think, $50 billion a year. No one had done that calculation before. So at this point, if you get in early, you can shape big conversations, big public policy discussions. As things get picked up, more players get involved, the space narrows, and you're talking about framing, ways to think about an issue, particular policies, particular forms of finance, and you get narrower and narrower down to solutions, problems, and then you're down to text. And the kind of research you do should be shaped by where you are in this funnel. And then out the other side, on the right-hand side, is a big role for civil society organizations, which is implementation. Has any of this stuff that was agreed with all this discussion about dollars and text and legal commitments and non-legal commitments, has any of it been implemented? So I think it's quite helpful to think about the timing of a given issue. And right now I'd say climate change is down here, whereas 20 years ago it was here, and maybe even here on the implementation side. More about timing really does matter. Get in early, get in on a new issue. So geoengineering, for example, is just coming up. It's an issue which is worrying a lot of people, but also exciting a lot of people. Now is a good time to get involved in this if you know anything about geoengineering and say, well, this is what we need to do. These are some of the problems. You know, you can shape it now when in 10 years' time, it will be too late. Plan around the political timetable. Political parties and leaders have moments when they actually are interested in new ideas. For example, in some countries, when they're drawing up the manifesto or elections or when a new leader has been elected, or when a new leader is going to be elected. So think about how you plan around the political timetable. Do you give seminars to all the new candidates for MPs in an upcoming election to give them some briefings around the things you're working on based on your research? The political timetable is really crucial. Doesn't always fit with the research timetable, where we have our own research pipeline, our timeline, the papers we want to publish. Throw that away. If you want to have impact, you've got to think about the political timetable. And then possibly the biggest one of all is this idea that shocks are crucial windows of opportunity. That, yeah, policymakers are busy, they know what they think, they've got their manifesto commitments, they're doing what they plan to do, and then something happens like COVID or a massive flood or an enormous economic crisis, and suddenly they realize that their existing tools are not enough, and they're open to ideas. Now, when they're open to ideas, they're also in a state of chaos and terror about what's going on. Whether they pick up the phone to you or read your paper is going to depend on whether they know who you are and trust you. So we're back to relationships. You have to make relationships in peacetime so that you can use these shocks as windows of opportunity to get your research message across during a crisis. This issue has gone more and more up the agenda, I think, in recent years. Who is doing presenting the research? There's a lot of criticism of the role of people like me in the research business, going to countries like this cartoon is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, employing local researchers, calling them research assistants, and then somehow they never appear on the final paper. And when they look in the mirror, there's nothing there. There's also the whole issue of manels and men-only publications. So manels are men-only panels, and a very funny website exists where you can send in a photo of a manel and they put a picture of David Hasselhoff going like this, just using humor to undermine, and it's had real impact. So you can sign up to a pledge. I signed up years ago. I will not appear on a men-only panel. So humor can be very effective on this kind of thing as well. How to engage targets. It's actually really good to engage targets before the research is published. You can do that in various ways. You can ask the targets, the minister or the senior civil servant or whoever you're trying to influence, would you be on a reference group for our new piece of research? They may be flattered. They may never show up, but it just gives them a little bit of ownership of what you're doing. And they may think they can influence it. Could we come and interview you or for the research? Because we really value your opinion, even if you don't, even if you have no intention of listening or taking any notice of what the minister says, the interview itself builds the relationship. Could you review our draft and give us comments? Again, you don't have to listen to the comments, but it pulls people in. Right? Adapt to their timetables, build relationships. I've talked about the messengers. Interesting distinctions between how you use research in closed versus open political systems, and a bit counterintuitive. My experience, which is very anecdotal, is that research at a certain level is more effective when you're in a dictatorship, when you're in a closed political system like China or Russia, because civil servants, as long as it's not regime threatening, as long as you're not trying to overthrow the government, if you're just saying this form of benefit to disabled people does not work, civil servants actually have the space to listen and act upon it. Whereas in open political systems, they're much noisier. Everybody's shouting, everybody's lobbying, and it's actually harder to get research listened to. And I think I mentioned that relationships really matter. Okay, how to disseminate your findings, publish drafts. I always publish everything in draft. No one has ever stolen anything. That's one of the great fears of researchers, is that if I publish a draft, someone will steal it and publish it. It's never happened to me. That may be because, a comment on the quality of my work, but it's never happened to me. Summaries need to be summaries, 2 pages. The longest summary I've ever seen in Oxfam was 68 pages. And I asked them, what on earth are you doing? And they said, well, by the time we finished the paper, we just hated the subject and hated each other. And we just cut and paste our summary bits. And we got a 68-page executive summary. You may as well throw the paper away. No one reads more than 2 pages. And I'm now increasingly multimedia, and you can't say, we are just going to use one kind, blogs, infographics. people use different platforms according to their personal preference. I'm afraid you have to go broad and do stuff for all these, for the proliferating number of platforms. But remember that the senior people, the ministers, will not probably be reading blogs. They still want to see something in the newspapers, on the radio, or listen to their peers. Okay. Just to finish off, if I've got time, Dahlia, is that okay? Yep.
Yes.
So Oxfam, my colleagues at Oxfam put their heads together and sort of systematized this in a paper in 2018, and the World Bank very kindly did a blog summary. So the links will be in the PowerPoint when I send it around. But this is a sort of more systematic way of looking at some specialities that Oxfam uses, and I think quite effectively. So framing and branding, relationships, killer facts and graphics, and league tables and indices. So the framing and branding, I'm not going to talk about it, I don't think, no, I'm not, is spend a bit of time thinking about the language you're using, the words. What are you going to call this thing? So, if you come up with 3 or 4 names for the thing you want to work on and test them with an audience, see which has cut through, which resonates. This is an incredibly useful investment of time and effort because, it's all in the name. So, to take an example from the right wing in the US, they rebranded the inheritance tax the death tax, right? They're saying this is a tax on death. And that just gave it huge traction in terms of public debate, in terms of media, that kind of thing, coming up with a really smart name. It's something Donald Trump, I hate it, but he does it really well. He brands things. He brands people with a stupid name, and it sticks. So do it, but do it for good, Think about the branding. Don't say, so an example of bad branding, I used to work on something called Publish What You Pay, which wasn't bad branding, which was saying oil companies need to publish what they pay to governments so that civil society can look at the revenues and hold governments to account. Tony Blair, this is a long time ago, Tony Blair picked up the idea, but they rebranded it the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I mean, what does that mean? So, it can go the wrong way or it can go the right way, but you need to test it, use market research, find out what works as a brand. Relationships, often as researchers, you have a big asset, which is you have a CEO, somebody who is the big boss of your organization or of a partner organization who loves networking, who's got a fantastic set of contacts, who loves speaking on the basis of very little knowledge, as long as you give them a good briefing. Use it. Those CEOs are way into the decision makers. They have the relationships. They're a fantastic asset for you. And sometimes the advocacy team, if you have one, that's also what they're doing. They're networking, constantly building their relationships. And then 2 other things I'll talk about in more, because they're more research-based, killer facts and league tables. So killer facts. So a colleague of mine in Oxfam, Ricardo Fuentes, a Mexican, was just messing about and with numbers because he's a geek, and he realized that there were 2 interesting databases which he could compare. One database was by Credit Suisse, the Swiss bank, which was the distribution of wealth in the world, right, by population. And the other database was who has the most wealth amongst the rich people from Forbes. So what he did was say, well, we could compare these. So he worked out how much wealth is owned by the poorest 3.5 billion people, the poorest half of the world. And then he just went down the Forbes list, adding it up. And by the time he got to the 85 richest people in the world, he found that they were equal numbers. So he had what we call a killer fact. And a killer fact is something which is a juxtaposition which exposes an injustice. So you're opposing the richest people on the planet with the poorest people on the planet, and the degree of inequality is the injustice. And this took him a day, maybe 2 days, maybe less. And Oxfam lived on it for years. This was just in time for the Davos summit in January in the relevant year. So timing again, it dominated the media for that summit, and for subsequent summits, we updated the figures and it got down to 6. They were enough for a yacht in the first year. 3 or 4 years in, they were enough for a golf cart. And each time it meant that people arriving at Davos were being asked questions about inequality. And so this was a really effective bit of framing, but also this killer fact idea. They don't always work. You know, you may try 10 of these and only one of them will land. But when the one lands, it lands really big. So think in your work, what are our killer facts? What is the thing we're going to put on the viral photo, the viral, you know, image, the meme? One other piece of advice on this: when you do it, your research has to be absolutely rock solid. You have to have sources for all of this stuff. You have to have tested it with somebody who doesn't necessarily agree with you. Because if you do this and it's wrong, or it's even challengeable, you will suffer major reputational harm. So you need to be really, really firm when you do these things. And the same goes for these things, league tables. Now, league tables play into a characteristic of leaders, which is that they're very competitive. Whether they're political leaders or chief executives of companies, they like to be top, they like to be first, they like to be best. This is a league table of the 10 biggest food companies in the world. And it compares their company policies, not what they actually do, just what they have written down across a bunch of things called land, treatment of farmers, what they do with water, what they do on climate. And we have a transparent methodology of ranking them and then adding up the numbers and getting to an overall total. And Unilever comes top. Unilever is like the Denmark of big companies. It always comes top, right? But interestingly, 1 year, and then what you do is you then repeat this every year. Because what happens is the people at the top say, look at us, we're top. The people at second and third think, damn it, we want to become top. And the people at 9 or 10 try and rubbish the methodology, because they're never going to get to be top. They just try and make it go away. So you need to, again, to be solid on your methodology. 1 year, Unilever came second or third. The CEO of Unilever, which is a major multinational company, was on the phone that night to the CEO of Oxfam, shouting at him, demanding to know why Unilever wasn't top. So these things really cut through. There's lots of these around, again, and they're a lot more work than killer facts. So test them. Don't expect that they will all work, but when they work, they're really effective. I'm going to stop there. Feel free to ask questions, make comments, anything you like. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing that. I can go back into the slides if people want clarification.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Green. Can you go back to actually the 4 pillars, the framing, the branding, and the relationship? Because actually this one is the core of this training, because at the end of the day, when we are constructing the message, and this is what we have been doing for the past 2 weeks, is that you have to put yourself in the no, I was talking about the other one, about the framing and the branding, the specialty things that appear to the report of Oxfam.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Yes, those ones, yes. So because really this is the core of the message that we want everyone to end this training with. Like, framing and branding is very important, because this is how they construct the message to be able to reach to the people. So if I didn't sell my message to the audience and I didn't test this relationship between me and the audience and what they want, my message won't be clear. So at the end, we are selling something to the people, and we have to believe in this first, then we can know how to sell it. We also talked about the power of 3, that you have to have like a slogan, you have to have something, a call to action, something like Black Lives Matters. So you have to create this in your message so that it can reach the people, and the relationship between the message and the audience, and where media fits here, because the media is the medium actually, but the audience are different. So this is how we can see this. The killer facts is very important, as you said. And you said something very interesting. We also worked on when it comes to make the message new, even if you feel that it's not that big, make it big and new, and highlight the facts and figures and the tables in your message. So I really wanted to end with this, because really it grabs all the conclusions and the facts that we have been working with. I just will leave the floor to my co-trainer, Emmy, if she wants to add something, and then we will open the floor for questions, and then maybe go back to Emmy and I when it comes to our own questions. Thank you so much, Emmy.
Yeah, I don't want to comment. I think I'll just ask the participants if they have any questions, because you have Asim and Mercy, who come from a research background. And Mercy has been asking us from day one, you know, like she has to reach the policymakers, she has to speak in a panel, and she really wants to try and get her message across succinctly. These people know what they're doing. They're experts in their fields. Mercy works with an organization that deals with smart soil testing, if I got that right, Mercy, and soil advisory. And Asim is a veteran researcher in agriculture in Egypt. So they're not communications people at all, but they're here to learn how to relate their messages to very diverse audiences, you know, from the farmers on the ground in the sense of Mikhail, who has to work with the farmers, to policymakers, and just to colleagues and regional international colleagues, when, especially for things that are coming up like Sharm el-Sheikh in November. So I am going to turn to Asim, Mikhail, and Mercy to ask for if you have any feedback or questions for Dr. Green.
Just for everyone's attention, I'm going to turn off the recording just so you can ask questions and answer them more comfortably and more openly if you'd like.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mahmoud.
Is there any for turning off the recording? I think it should be part of, so that we can have the responses.
Yeah, I think so. Can we keep the recording? Because
just keep it, yeah. Just keep it, Mahmoud.
Okay. If everyone is
Okay.
fine, for sure. Thanks. Thank everyone. Thanks, Mahmoud. Okay, go ahead. Who wants to start? Mercy?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Duncan, and of course the team that is training us from the TRF. For me, I'm just impressed by what you talked about, because it nails home some of our experiences and challenges. And like Daria mentioned, I'm coming from the research, and now I'm in private sector. And one of the challenges with private sector communication to development to policymakers is that they're not patient at all. While you showed a process, and you showed a way to target, and you showed also a way to brand, to package so that you can reach them, and the various ways you need to reach them. I think to me, that really is very impressive and really impactful to me and to my work. I'll definitely refer to your presentation over and over again, because it gives some guide on that. But my question is, makers and decision makers, you're not. Can you hear me? My internet is getting a bit unstable.
Now, but we're glitching a bit at the start, but
Okay.
from the start of the question, it was fine.
So my question is, when you refer to policymakers and decision makers, I want to guess that you're not just referring to public institutions, but you're also referring to the wider, development, donors, and the rest of the people, and the same, or even private sector, or any kind of people who are at the position of making decisions whether or not your message to them clicks and they're interested to work with you, or they're interested to participate, or they're interested to take it up from where you left. And whether this applies across, and if it doesn't, what are some of the tweaks or some of the insights you'd have, especially if it is then to the private sector or to development partners or to probably donors. Yeah, but thank you very much. This is very insightful.
that's a really interesting question, Mercy. So yes, it definitely applies to if you're trying to influence any target individuals or institutions. It also applies to your own institution, because I don't know about you, but people in Oxfam, the big bosses in Oxfam, for some reason don't do what I say. It's really annoying. So if you want to influence your own institution, you have to use these same tricks, right? And I've lost count of the number of times in Oxfam when people who understand how to do this, because they do it to external organizations and governments, internally they just cry or shout or just get really upset, and they don't use those tactics internally. So you've got to be just as cold-blooded in a way and analytical when you're bringing about change in your own institution. I think that's one point. whether there are differences, I don't think there are that many differences. Okay, you're basically operating on the basis that if you put yourselves in the shoes of the people you're trying to influence, what will make them look good? What will make them get re-elected? You know, what will make them feel good about themselves? You know, these are the sort of things where it's all about this ability to be in the shoes of the other and then work backwards and say, okay, so how do I frame my research so that it resonates in that way with that person? Whereas, you know, I've been in meetings where the minister in Britain, where the minister came in ready to listen, and the first NGO person who stood up thought, I'm speaking truth to power, and started doing this. And you could just see the minister shutting off. Look at that. Yeah, okay, how long is this? Yeah, I'm out of here. And nothing was going to be achieved. Whereas if you can actually understand how their world is, then you can get to them. And I think that's true for all those different categories. One other thing I'll say is that one area, I don't know if you work at subnational level, but there is a natural, an easy way of doing comparisons between subnational areas of government. So either between municipalities, between provinces, states, depending on the political system, and you just do a league table with those. It's a very, very reliable way of getting coverage and getting influence. Even in places like Vietnam, you know, there was an NGO that did an accountability league table of the 69 municipalities in Vietnam. The first year they got death threats, and the second year they got people phoning up saying, how do we get a better result? How do we move up the table? Because we're worried about what the Communist Party is going to say. So, you know, these things are very, very transferable, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mercy. Asim or Mikhail, do you have any question?
Yeah, please.
Sure, awesome.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan, for your fruitful presentation.
Hang on, if you could introduce yourself first, Asim, just, you know, say your work, and that will really help. Thank you.
All right, so I am Asim Abdelmenaim. I'm working as Agriculture Research Center, Associate Professor in Agriculture Research Center. So my work is related to academia, only academia, okay? But on the field, I'm not teaching the students. The question is, of any assessment, global assessment, or even regional assessment, there is a summary for policymaker, okay? So this one is, or summary is about 45 pages. For example, for EPES global assessment, or even any thematical assessment, about 30 to 35 pages. I guess 35 or even 45 pages is a huge amount of the policymakers, different ministers, or even the prime minister or whatever to read. So what is the rule of this one? What is the features or key features of, or for whom this one?
So these
35 pages, 45 pages.
Thanks, Assem. Yeah, I mean, so these are the kind of overview chapters, aren't they? The overview papers, summary papers of something like an IPCC report, which is thousands of pages. So they are useful for academics, because most academics don't want to read the whole thing. They may be useful for researchers in government, but I think you have to do a summary of the summary. And the summary of the summary can be a key talking points kind of document, a slide set, a video, you know, an animation, different, or all of them. But there's absolutely no way you can stop at a 35-page document and think you're going to reach the target audience. It's impossible. So yeah, I think you have to go down the rabbit hole of producing shorter and shorter things. As I think Dalia said at the beginning, I blog. I have a blog called From Poverty to Power, and I blog, you know, 3 to 5 times a week. A lot of what I'm doing is summarizing. So today I was writing a review of this new book on development by Stephen Duncan, who's a professor at Oxford, who was advisor to the British government and has been, you know, working in development for years. I review it in 1,000 words. And probably lots of people will say, oh, good, I don't have to read the book anymore. But it's the only way to reach a lot of people, because very few people read books anymore. It's a sad truth of the modern world. And you have to give people short form stuff.